Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL round number 2 overview and analysis video in the summer split playoffs, the split number 2 playoffs, if you will. We are getting into our first elimination series of the entire playoffs here, so we're going to know our first 2 teams that are officially out, and we're also going to have our 2, winners round 2 matchups that are going to determine who goes on to winners finals. Remember, if you win winners finals, if you get top 2 here in the NACL, you are guaranteed to go into the promotion relegation tournament to try and get yourself into the LTA, which is the goal, like the end all be all for every single team at this level, at this tournament, in the playoffs, all of that stuff. All of them are trying to get promoted into tier 1. So a lot on the line for a couple of teams here today. And that means a lot to cover in today's video, so strap in. Let me know what you thought down in the comment section below. Very curious to always know how you guys feel about a lot of these games. Of course, I will be going over everything, and I will be doing so by going series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we'll be looking at the updated bracket after the 4 series that we will cover today, and kind of talk about where I think teams are headed by the end of this video. Best of 3s are done. We still have 2 more to talk about at the end here in terms of the upper bracket, but lower bracket is already starting the best of 5 stage. So a lot to really delve into, a lot more games to discuss, and that means we're really getting into the thick of things. So without further ado, let's jump into our first series. We're going to start on the lower part of the bracket because that's where the NACL started in terms of the games that they got, which means we start with our best of 5s going into the playoffs here. Our first best of 5 and our first elimination series of the playoffs in the summer split was a big one. 2 teams that I definitely do not think looked at themselves as teams that could be first out in the playoffs here. It was the number 1 seeded Supernova taking on the number 5 seeded Citadel Gaming, and Supernova is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. They're going to take this series in 4 games. Not a particularly shocking outcome once Supernova ended up going down to lower bracket, but the shock is that they are here in the first place. Of course, getting upset by Blue Otter in round number 1 in the 1 versus 8 matchup, that's just not something that really happens here in the NACL, especially with how good of a regular season Supernova ended up having. The fact that this is supposedly a super team in terms of the roster construction, I think a lot of people were just so surprised by how Supernova ended up performing in that first round matchup, but they get some of their mojo back and they end up taking down Citadel here. Unfortunately, it's just a terrible draw for Citadel. They face 2 teams in the playoffs that they pretty clearly are worse than, just in terms of raw talent, and even with a couple of really nice performances. Kenvi, I think, having a really great day. I don't think Instinct and Diamond were all that bad for Citadel. It's just not enough to be able to get them over the hump against Supernova, who is just a little bit of a better team. They had to play 2 of the best teams in the entire league as their only 2 playoff series in Conviction and Supernova. I wouldn't take it too seriously that this team is finishing in 7th, 8th place, depending on who else loses in this round, but certainly not the result this organization was looking for. They wanted to be the best team coming in from the open qualifiers, and that will not be the case with Dorado still in the upper bracket. But let's go ahead and talk about the games themselves, of course, starting with Supernova and starting with my player of the series, which is going to go to Hoarder in the top lane. Really hard for me to look in a different direction here. It really did feel like he opened up everything throughout the beginning part of this series. His game 1 on Gwen was absolutely massive, and I think that was probably the biggest 1v9 of the entire series. He really was that large in game number 1 and really was able to take over that game, and I even think his games 2 and 3 were pretty excellent. I think if you're kind of getting biased a little bit more towards game number 4, which I will do for dud of the series because I think that there weren't a lot of easy options for that, then maybe you can kind of move away from Hoarder, because I think the York game was, ironically enough, probably his weakest game of the entire series, but outside of that, he was absolutely excellent, and he needed to show this kind of performance. Remember, in round number 1 against Blue Otter and against Quacker, I think Hoarder just got outplayed. He was the one player that I was really looking at saying like, you did not play well in a big moment and you really needed to step up. We know he can have those big, clutch playoff performances. He did it for Conviction last split, but you needed to see it here on Supernova. You needed to see that he could still be somebody that pushes the game forward, and I don't think he's getting enough credit for just how well he played, especially throughout the beginning part of this. So a player of the series as a whole for me definitely has to go to Hoarder. Scary Jerry or Breezy, I think, are the other 2 that you could really consider here. Dardoch ended up getting it on broadcast. I don't really understand that at all. I don't think you can give this to Dardoch or Blaze Olive. I think both of them were kind of out of the conversation for me, just in terms of who the options were. To me, it should be Hoarder or Scary Jerry, but Breezy, very, very active and honestly a gigantic playmaker early on in the series as well. I will say with Scary Jerry, he's the one who stepped up, in the closer. I would say, generally speaking, on the Jhin in particular in game 4, he played an absolutely terrific Jhin game in that 4th and final one and really closed out the series strong. Only reason I didn't give it to Jerry is I don't think he created enough at the beginning of the series in the same way that Hoarder and Breezy were able to do, but certainly wouldn't be upset with a Scary Jerry player of the series here. Breezy continues to be excellent. It's really cool to see him be able to step up against a player in Diamond who's a former champion at the tier 2 level and genuinely showcase that he can still be a top 1 or a top 2 support. I think that that is really kind of the ceiling for a player like Breezy, so it's nice to see that that is available for him. But again, I don't think everything was perfect for Supernova. They end up losing game number 3, even though they were in that game. Game number 2 was quite close, and they needed a lot more, expert level production, I would say, to close that out. It didn't need to be as difficult as it ended up being in game number 2. I think part of that is Dardoch, quite frankly, I don't think was as good as Kenvi. Here today, he's the one player that I just wasn't super into gameplay-wise. I'm a big fan of what Dardoch has been for this team over the course of this split, but this was not the series, I think, to kind of showcase that. At least in my opinion, I was very surprised when chat ended up voting him as player of the series because, while I think he was okay, I don't think he was sensational, and I think you could say the same thing for a Blaze Olive. I think both mid laners ended up kind of underperforming in some pretty big moments today. ABO, of course, stepping up when it mattered the most. I thought his Silas game in Game 4 was probably his best of the entire series, but for Supernova, I think you were really relying on at least a couple of players stepping up into big-time roles here, and they did that. Hoarder was big, Scary Jerry was big, I think Breezy was really big. So for Supernova, you got everything you needed to get. It just might not have been the cleanest performance of all time. And for Citadel, on the other side, it was really difficult to try to find a dud of the series here because you immediately eliminate Kenvi. I think Kenvi just played way too well here today for me to even consider him as dud of the series. In fact, I would argue that he played better than Dardoch. He just didn't have the surrounding core that Dardoch had with Supernova here today. Instinct and Diamond, while they had their flaws, and I think that there were a lot of times where Instinct in particular was positioning way too aggressively, I simply cannot look at the way that they performed and say that they were the problem here today. And so it kind of comes down to, okay, Philip was probably a little bit more consistently bad across the series, even in their good games like game number 3. He wasn't exactly taking anything over, like he wasn't super influential, where Bradley did have a couple of good games. He was really good on the Syndra in game 3. I think the Aurelia was fine, but game 1 on the Annie, not very good. In game 4, he was the biggest liability, in my opinion, on the Victor. So it's kind of up to you which of the solo laners you want to give dud of the series to. I'm giving it to Bradley for that Victor game, but again, it really is kind of up for debate. Philip was worse than Hoarder, and Bradley just never really got his feet under him in this series. I'm not blaming Citadel all that much, though. Again, we have to look at what this team was in the regular season and even what their projection was going into the split. I know a lot of us had them as a top 4 team, but that's because there was a big 3 before we knew it was a big 4 with conviction, and Citadel was the best team outside of that. They are living up to that reputation. They just can't break through that upper echelon. It was, Conviction who took them out in round number 1, a team that has clearly shown themselves to be a lot better than, anybody really expected them to be, and then Supernova, the number 1 seed who took them out in the lower part of the bracket. The fact that Philip and Bradley maybe struggled a bit more in this series isn't all that surprising when you're going up against players that are some of the most consistent and talented in the entire league. So it is what it is. I think there is a lot to build off of here for Citadel. They're safe and everything. Making playoffs means you don't have to go into a relegation tournament or anything like that going into next year. So as long as this org and this league, I guess, is still around, Citadel will be here participating in it. And we know that the people who are, I'm a bit biased here, the people who run Citadel are fantastic, and they obviously care a lot about the product on the Rift. They're not going to be super happy with this finish, but I think that there is still a lot to build off of here. And I think there are players that you can definitely look at going into next year as potential mainstays for the team. But for now, their run ends in 7th, 8th place as one of the first 2 teams out, and Supernova will stay alive. Remember, their extra life still very much is burned. They have to stay perfect throughout basically the rest of the playoffs in order to even make the promotion tournament at this point. Their backs are still very much up against the wall, but this was a good sign that not everything we saw in the regular season was a facade. But then moving on now to our second elimination series, our second lower bracket series, and it was a matchup between the number 3 seeded DarkZero and the number 7 seeded Winthrop University, where DarkZero are going to pick up the 3-0 clean sweep in this best of 5. They're going to move their way to round number 2 and kind of make amends for their loss in round 1 to Dorado that I think a lot of people, me included, were very, very surprised by. They honestly played, I would say fine in that series, a little bit below average in terms of maybe what you could expect out of a number 3 seed, but Dorado obviously just really stepping up. Sushi having such an incredible series in round 1 and DarkZero not really having an answer to that. They wanted to make sure they were more prepared for a game-breaking type of player in this one, with mobility still being on the other side of this matchup, and all they did was play as aggressive as they possibly could, and it very much worked out for them in all 3 games. You would have liked to maybe see them be a bit more clinical in terms of their execution, but really that's a nitpick because this was a fantastic series for DarkZero, and unfortunately unfortunately for Winthrop, they did not have a very good playoffs. I think it's pretty clear that this was the weakest team in the playoffs just in terms of their production. They got blown out in round number 1 by Luminosity, but it's Luminosity. You know, you feel okay about that. And then you have the monumental task of having to face DarkZero as well in the lower bracket because they get knocked down by Dorado. And so you just have to play 2 of the top 3 teams in the playoffs as your only 2 matchups, and you don't get to win a single game in that regard. Unfortunately for Winthrop, they didn't feel all that competitive in this series. This really felt completely controlled by DarkZero, but after this year, with this being kind of their weakest playoff performance, we'll just say, of the entirety of their year, both really in collegiate and here in the NACL, I think you can kind of excuse it at least a little bit with how things have gone so far in 2025. So let's go ahead and get into it. Zyko, for me, is going to get player of the series. This feels like a pretty obvious one. I think that there are a lot of great options on DarkZero because I think everybody ended up playing really well, but the macro and the aggression from DarkZero was really what kind of created and evolved every chance that they had on the map, and I think a lot of that ends up coming down to Zyko. He has nearly 100% KP in game number 1, ends up being super aggro in game 2, and then plays the most in-your-face thresh you will see, especially with an Aphelios in game number 3. You want to punish this Yunara Lulu bot lane, and Zyko did exactly that, but it's not just game number 1. Again, I want to make it, or game number 3, I want to make it clear that he was very good and arguably the best player on the Rift in almost every single game in this series. There was a pretty large support gap just in terms of how you could create chances in favor of DarkZero, and I think Zyko really expressed that in this series. He's kind of the veteran member of this team. Not kind of, he is the veteran member of this Maryville DarkZero team that has been in the organization for quite a long time. And for him to still consistently be stepping up and really creating opportunities for everybody on the team and, you know, taking away opportunities from the other side is still really impressive. I still believe he is arguably the best support in Tier 2 right now, a player that should have gotten promoted with Scary Jerry up to the LTA across this offseason. It didn't quite happen, but he's going to have the chance to get his team there because, again, he really is going to be pushing DarkZero forward. They still have their backs up against the wall, but Zyko, the player you have to watch out for. Kizno was incredible in this series, the other player I really wanted to shout out. I think the reason Zyko ends up getting it a bit more for me over Kizno is it really felt like Kizno's effectiveness came more so in the back half of this series, the Xin Zhao, and then really the back end on the Wukong game, where it really felt like he was taking over. I think Zyko was a little bit better in game number 1, which gives him a bit of an edge for me for player of the series, but Kizno still was absolutely terrific, and even if he wasn't quite as in-your-face aggressive as Zyko was in this series, I still think he created a ton of chances, and the moment he did start playing a lot more aggro, things got even easier for DarkZero like they did in game number 3, so credit to Kizno. I thought Sajed was obviously fantastic. Look at that Vayne game in game number 2. He has the confidence to pull that out. That's a Viper move, obviously, but Sajed can more than operate that champion at a high level. Vayne is honestly a champ that I think could theoretically be just good competitively, at least in certain matchups, and I think this was a good example of just, if you can play Vayne, why not try to play Vayne? It doesn't have to be this really niche counter pick. It can just be something that you can flex in situations where you're going up against Pantheon, Tom Kench, right? Even the Jhin in game number 2, like the Vayne's going to be able to punish a lot of that. Toasty was much more consistent than he was in the first series of the playoffs here. K was much better on the top side, but really this was a macro masterclass. This was kind of a showcase that the team that makes the most plays and continues to keep their foot on the gas is the one that's going to be able to control the way that the games go, and I'm really happy for DarkZero in that regard. For Winthrop on the other side, a lot of negatives you can give towards this individual performance, but I think I want to talk a little bit more holistically about their year as a whole, because I think Winthrop honestly is a team that should be commended for how they performed. I had significantly lower expectations for what Winthrop would be going into 2025. I thought this was going to be one of the weaker teams in Tier 2. Now, obviously, Tier 2 had a couple of teams that did not have very high expectations at the beginning of the year with Pulse and with AMI, but I didn't think Winthrop was going to be a team that, you know, with an improved league and with teams like Dorado and Citadel coming in to take those spots, I didn't think Winthrop was going to be a team that on paper was able to hold their own, but that's just not the case. Like, they have been more than good enough to show that all of these players are Tier 2 caliber. They just aren't quite there yet in terms of the consistency. Only 35 for me is going to get dud of the series. I think he was fine, all things considered, but boy, did things look really bad when he started getting taken advantage of in draft in the back half of this series. You look at, obviously, the Tom Kench getting absolutely obliterated by the Vayne in game number 2. There's not really a ton he can do there. You see the Lulu in game number 3 kind of getting obliterated by the Thresh in terms of just how aggressive that lane ends up playing. The Yunara never really gets a chance to scale, and only 35 just feels like he's on the back foot in terms of every play that's being made. It is kind of the life of the support, but at some point, if the enemy support is the one making all the plays and you're just kind of reacting and your team is losing, that's not a good spot to be in, and I think that was the case this series for only 35. I think you could make some arguments that Wilson could be dead of the series here. He got completely completely out jungled by Kisno. The macro was not there. Nautilus jungle making its first appearance here in tier 2. First appearance on the channel, I believe, ever. I'm not quite sure if I was doing the channel when Nautilus jungle was last meta, but Nautilus jungle coming back because of the changes on this patch and did not work out in game number 1. We'll just say that. I think Denethor played a rather weak series, all things considered on the top side. Sword was significantly weaker than Toasty, which has kind of been a recurring trend. I think mid lane got so much better going into the summer split that, players like Sword that did really well in spring because mid lane was pretty exploitable. It's not quite as easy anymore to exploit that mid lane matchup. Mobility continues to be the win condition, but it's really hard for him to be able to actually win the game in situations where the team is really losing everywhere else. And even he wasn't winning in lane. It's not like he was winning, up in gold and just losing the game. It was an overall effort from DarkZero that was just better than Winthrop, but this is expected. This is what you could have anticipated between these two teams. I can't feel all that upset for Winthrop after they did overperform so much in the spring split and still got into playoffs here in the summer split. They might have not performed like they wanted to, but at least there's something to build on here. And for DarkZero, they move on to the next round. Very similar story to Supernova. This is a team and an organization that expects nothing less than getting in and promoting to the LTA. And they're going to have to, step up their game in order to do so. They've kind of been the clear-cut number 3 team. They might be even lower than that right now in terms of a lot of people's expectations, but if they can keep these kinds of aggressive performances up and control games in the way that they were able to in this series, a lot of things can change between now and some pivotal matchups. But now that we've wrapped up our elimination series of this video, our 2 that are going to determine the lower bracket success chances, we have to move back up to the upper bracket as we get our, upper bracket semifinals. Really, the 2 series that are going to qualify teams for winners finals and subsequently mean that the winners are only 1 series away from getting themselves into the promotion tournament after today. So winning here is crucial. It genuinely does, I think, impact your tournament the most of almost any round in terms of how much you would have to play on the lower bracket. So very important for these teams to find a win here, and that starts off with the matchup between the number 4 seeded Conviction and the number 8 seeded Blue Otter, where Conviction are going to pick up the victory. They're going to dominate this series 2-0, and quite frankly, they are going to roll Blue Otter in the matchup that we never got in the regular season. Conviction kind of proving that, hey, if we had played this out, maybe we would have picked up that win. Maybe you wouldn't quite be here in the playoffs, but Blue Otter still on that redemption arc, trying their best. They're not eliminated again because we're moving back up to the upper bracket. These teams still have their extra life as opposed to the teams that lost earlier in the video, so Blue Otter will be moving down to the lower part of the bracket, but it does not get easier from this point onwards. Only the best teams in the entire league remain in terms of just where you are at to face regularly in the playoffs. So, congratulations to Conviction. We'll see how Blue Otter can adapt, but really kind of breaking down this series, it's not going to take all that much time. This is really easy to talk about. This was not close under any circumstance. Like, Conviction just destroyed Blue Otter. They were better in every aspect of the game. They ended up getting snowballs in both games. In game number 1, it was out of control, basically across the map. I think Stunt had a phenomenal game on the Braum. I think Perry did a great job on the Pantheon to really push this macro advantage with the Pantheon Talia mid-jungle duo, and Blue Otter's Udyr didn't really have an answer to be able to adapt with. Even Array, who had a bit of gold on the Corki, couldn't really do anything in that game number 1. But then you transition into game 2, and the snowball starts even earlier with this Viego just getting so out of control, and then Viper gets his Riven down in the bot lane. There is a reason that everybody has been banning this out, even against, Viper in the bot lane. Like, he's not playing top lane or anything. He's more than willing to dominate the game 2v2 with Riven Alistar in the bot lane if he needs to, and he definitely can. He goes deathless in this series, but I just can't bring myself to give him player of the series, despite the fact that his KP was the highest on the entire team. Despite the fact that he goes deathless, I think I have to give it to Perry because the snowball was just that impactful in terms of how things ended up breaking down. Really phenomenal stuff from Perry, who has been kind of the unsung hero. Him and Evolved, I think, have both been kind of the unsung heroes of this team. So far this split, Viper, I think, has been getting a lot of the attention. Even TF Blade, I think, has been getting quite a bit of it. At the end of the split, Stunt has been very good, but I think the bot lane is talked about very heavily in terms of Conviction. The mid-jungle duo has been maybe the most consistent in the entire league, just in terms of the advantages they can get. Perry has mostly been playing a lot of these engagers, and he's been going very deep to set up these aggressive engage angles for the rest of the team to capitalize on, for Viper and for TF Blade to really be able to follow through with. And he's died in a lot of those exchanges, but for the most part, those have been really worthwhile trades. He got the chance to actually be a carry here in game number 2 on the Viego, and it very much ended up working out. Was much stronger than Kryra, who was the only form of disengage coming in on the side of Blue Otter when they saw this Riven Viego comp end up getting finalized for Conviction. You needed to be able to answer that with the Zyra, and taking that champion out of the game makes it basically impossible for Blue Otter to play. So credit to Perry. He was phenomenal, and he really has been across this entire split. Not that that should be a surprise to anybody who's watched this channel. I mean, this guy was popping off in 2022, 2023 when, Fear and, even on the Dignitas era, like teams, like Perry has always been a top tier performer at the tier 2 level, disguised that one playoff run that people forget he was phenomenal in. Like it happens, right? Like Perry's a really good player at this level, and people forgot because he went into content creation, but here he is right back into being one of the best junglers in tier 2. But again, how can you not point out Viper? 14, 0, and 21 on 2 games, one on Yunara and one on Riven. Talk about 2 conflicting playstyles, but he still plays the Yunara very aggressively. He's just been everything you could ask for out of an AD carry. You might not sit there and be like, oh, he's actively winning every single game, but his role is not to create every chance for his team. His role is to capitalize on everything that is created, and I think he does that arguably better than almost any other AD carry in the entire league right now. The setups are brilliant from the rest of Conviction, but you still need an ADC that's going to maximize their damage, and again, I don't know if anyone's doing that quite like Viper is right now on multiple different champions, not just the Riven or these weird counter picks, but he's playing Yunara, and he's one of the better Yunara players in the entire league right now, as we saw in game number 1. So everything just kind of clicking in that regard. I think Evolved and TF Blade were great. Stunt has been phenomenal throughout this series. I thought the Alistar game in particular in game 2 was phenomenal. Absolutely stellar stuff from him. So Conviction genuinely look like one of the teams to beat right now in the NACL, and if this team ends up making the promotion tournament, like if they go up against the winner of this next winners series and end up actually taking that and going to the promotion tournament and getting into the LTA, are we even going to be surprised with the kind of output that they have right now? This team feels incredibly strong, and quite frankly, they feel very difficult to deal with in these fearless best of fashion tournaments. Like it's almost like they're built for it in terms of their solo queue champion pools. So very excited to see that. But then for Blue Otter on the other side of this matchup, obviously this has to feel kind of bad. This was your chance to prove that you deserved to be in the playoffs all along, not just getting in there because of the forfeit from Conviction. And to not look all that competitive in either of these 2 games has definitely got to be a bit frustrating for the team. That being said, you can't really be frustrated by losing to one of the better teams in the league. You already pulled off a massive upset in round number 1. Like, being here is already really cool, and I think they played like a team that pulled off a massive upset in round number 1, where they just didn't feel like they had the firepower to compete with Conviction in terms of the aggressiveness, and once they got behind early, it just kind of was doomed for this team. Dead of the series can go in a lot of different directions. I'm giving it to Samikin. I think it should go to one of Kryra or Samikin. I think both of them were kind of the weak links of the team in this series, if you will. Samikin had a miserable game 1 on the Orianna. I think that's really the one that stands out to me in terms of just not being very good, but the Hui was also not much better in game 2. How much is he supposed to do in that game? Kind of up to you to determine, but this is the problem with that kind of playstyle, this, long range barrage type of playstyle that Samikin's very good at. The Zoes, the Luxes, the Huis, like those types of champions that can really be taken advantage of when a Viego or a Riven ends up getting super fed on the other side. You don't have a ton of answers to be able to deal with that inbuilt in the kit. That's the weakness of the champion. So for me, Samikin, having the lowest KP on the team and really just not being involved a lot in the game, it's not good. Like, it wasn't a good look. I think Kryra also, mostly for the Zyra in game 2, but it's not like the Wukong was a ton better in game number 1. Kryra was excellent in round number 1, really pushed Blue Otter over Supernova, and I'm a huge Kryra fan. You guys know I really like this guy. I think he could be an up-and-coming jungler to watch as like a tier 1 type of player, but this was not a great example of it. I do not think he played well. I think he got completely out-jungled and really lost all tempo pretty early on into this series. Array and Rovex weren't great, but I also don't think they were the biggest problems here. Array never really had a foothold to actually be able to play the game, and Quacker was the one player I think that was actually trying to do things. He just, picked Udyr and Olaf, some of his staple champions that can't really do anything when the enemy Viego gets out of control. What's Olaf supposed to do against a Viego getting resets or a Riven that just continuously can pump out all this damage with all of this setup? It's really hard for Quacker to play the game against a lot of these bruisers, and that ended up being a really big problem. So Blue Otter moved down to the lower part of the bracket. They still have, I guess they're utilizing their extra life now, but they're going to be moving down to face DarkZero. That is not an easy matchup, and we'll preview that at the end of the video. For now, we're going to talk about Conviction moving on to winners finals. They will take on the winner of the series we talk about next in this video, but only one more remaining. They just have to win one more series. It will be a best of 5, and it will be their first best of 5 as this group of players. I think there is reason to, at the very least, have questions about what they're going to do there, but honestly, at this point, I think pretty much every worry I had about what Conviction was going to be going into the NACL or Fearless Draft or whatever, I think all of them are gone. I think they have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are a team to beat in the NACL and a real threat to promote up into the LTA. But that's going to bring us to our second of the upper bracket series and our final series to cover in today's video. It was a matchup between the number 2 seeded Luminosity Gaming and the number 6 seeded Dorado Gaming. And Luminosity is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This was not a difficult series for them to take in terms of how things are going down. Kind of frustrating that both of our winners round 2 matchups were quite stompy in terms of just the way that things ended up going, but I guess he can't be all that surprised after kind of a round of upsets in round number 1. Teams like Dorado and Blue Otter getting into that upper bracket round 2 when nobody really expected them to do that. Unfortunately, it kind of all came, crashing down for them, kind of blew up in their face here, but still a decent performance, I would say, at least in comparison to what it could have been. So yes, Luminosity is much better, but honestly, we just saw Luminosity obliterate another team in round number 1. They might just be the best team in the NACL by like a large margin, and if that's the case, this certainly looks a lot less bad for a team like Dorado. So let's go ahead and get into what actually happened in these two games. I think it's pretty obvious that Tomio is player of the series. I've been kind of, I don't want to say avoiding giving him player of the series, but there have been so many times where it's like, oh, Tomio once again plays Sejuani and the map is completely controlled and there's nothing else the enemy team can do. And only so many times can I talk about that in like an interesting way and really kind of bring it up in a way that highlights Tomio doing something like crazy and different. But really, the way he plays tanks just makes it impossible for anybody else to play the game. It's the thing that I think makes him so strong at the tier 2 level, and the thing that I think makes me the most concerned about him at the tier 1 level in terms of just how that will translate. And we kind of saw that on Shopify last split, where it's just one of those things that, if you are able to get it off and control tempo and space in the way that he's able to, it's impossible to do anything about that. But you also kind of have to be the better jungler in order to make that work. And obviously Tomio is better than Kaido. He's better than a lot of the junglers, basically everyone at this level. Can he do that at the tier 1 level? I believe that he can at some point, but there is some risk, I think, in that kind of play style where he hasn't looked nearly as good on more aggressive picks. I think even in this meta, things like Xin Zhao have not been nearly as prevalent for Luminosity as they have been for other teams. That being said, there is no better tank player in the league at any position than Tomio. He is just so much better than everybody in that role. I honestly don't think his skill set is all that dissimilar to someone like Blabber in the LTA, and obviously long time for Cloud9 in the LCS, but he does have to develop a little bit more in that area to be able to kind of take advantage of that skill set a little bit more. But at least for now, man, like Deathless on Maokai Sejuani in a playoff series, yeah, that sounds pretty damn good. It sounds like a almost too good to be true type of thing to talk about. The rest of this team was great. Fake God was so much better than Orianna on the top side. You cannot give a weaker player Yorick in this kind of matchup. It's just not something that you're ever going to be able to get away with. And Bessa ended up really abusing that top side. Renekton was great in game 1 as well. Fake God's always been a very good Renekton. Insanity was excellent in this series. He's really just been playing the best league he's played all year over the course of this split. I think that there were moments in spring where you could see it, specifically the finals where he was terrific, but as I've said all split long, this guy has just been dominating games, and Shochi is not a pushover by any stretch of the imagination. Insanity is just in great form. Sushi obviously was the hero of round number 1 for Dorado, ended up really popping off and being the 1v9 type of threat for that team to get them to round 2. Tactical and Zazel much safer and much calmer in terms of how they want to play it. It's clear that the directive here for Luminosity was let Tomio control every bit of space, allow Insanity to be the one who gets to play aggressive and gets a lot of the resources, and then Tactical and Zazel can just take more of a backseat 2v2 type of role to not allow Sushi the opportunity to carry games and to get things out of control, force someone else on the other side to beat you, and that very much ended up working out for Luminosity. Even Tactical and Zazel, they go deathless in this series as well. 3-0 and 13 and 3-0 and 22 respectively, even if they weren't exactly the most like polarizing, like dominant players in terms of where the resources were going. Luminosity just kind of feels unbeatable right now, and honestly, it's not close who the favorites are in the playoffs. They really are that much better than everybody that they face, but who knows? Again, there have been other teams that have done well. They'll get the chance to prove it now in winners finals. And for Dorado on the other side, I still like this team. I think they're in a better spot than a team like Blue Otter, despite both of them getting blown out here in winners round 2, because I think Luminosity is not only better, in my opinion, than Conviction, and it's certainly a little bit more justifiable to kind of get destroyed in this particular matchup, but because I think a lot of the things that make Dorado good they never really had a chance to happen in this series. Sushi never really got the chance to take over. Shochi never really got to use that Galio to move around the map and, create for his own jungler. Like, that's the playstyle that Dorado, I think, thrives on, is Shochi on these roamers and then Kaido on these pseudo carries like Silas or Kindred in the jungle. Again, the problem is if you don't have tempo in any lane really at all on the map, map, it's really hard to execute that style. So Kaido is going to get dead of the series. I mean, when you pick Silas and Kindred jungle and things go disastrously, then it just kind of is what it is. You kind of have to just say, okay, it didn't work out. Oh, well, what go next, right? Like the lower bracket hopefully will be better. I think Orianna got outplayed. I already talked a bit about Shoji not really having any pressure in the mid lane, even if it's not entirely his fault. Sushi and Mixture didn't even really get to play the game. Again, Tactical and Zazel did the best job possible at completely neutralizing bot lane and not allowing any of the four of them to completely impact the game as a whole, which just meant that Luminosity's better top side ended up taking over. So it's just one of those series, man. Like, I'd love to sit here and say that Dorado is crashing back down to earth in the same way that Blue Otter is, but I do think there is some merit in saying that Dorado has something to build off of here. The concern is that now they go down to the lower bracket to take on Supernova, the #1 seed in the entirety of the regular season. They still have their backs up against the wall. There are no easy series remaining in the playoffs, but we'll see what their counter argument can be. For now, Luminosity very much the team to beat, despite what anybody else is looking like right now in the playoffs. There is nobody quite doing it at the level of Luminosity, and I would honestly be surprised if that doesn't stand true for the rest of the playoffs. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Round 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after 2 rounds of action. I guess a round and a half of action if you really want to make that point clear. We have our winners finals locked in. Conviction taking on Luminosity Gaming, the two teams that have easily looked the best so far in the playoffs, neither of them having dropped a single game yet. But we're not previewing that in today's video because they don't actually play next weekend. It's just the 2 lower bracket series that end up playing next week, and we're going to go ahead and preview them now, kind of talk about who I think will come out on top in both. Unfortunately, I do think both are pretty obvious on paper, but who knows? We've already gotten some upsets. There could be room for more. Starting with Dorado Gaming moving down from the upper bracket, taking on Supernova. Really difficult to imagine a world where Dorado end up having the firepower to beat Supernova, but I think this is going to be the closer of the 2 series because I do think there is a world where theoretically you can get Sushi and Shochi and even Kaido in a position where they can carry. Ariana was very good in round 1 against DarkZero. If you can beat DarkZero, you can beat Supernova on any given day, but especially with it now being best of 5, I think it really decreases the ability to have any of these bad games that we've seen these players have, these high volatile type of comps that Dorado needs to draft. I'm just not sure I believe in that against a team like Supernova. So for now, I have Supernova moving forward, and then Blue Otter taking on DarkZero. This one I feel a little bit more confident in. DarkZero is a team that I would expect to continue to move on. Blue Otter had a miracle result against Supernova, but I still have major question marks about whether or not this team has the talent to be able to compete with these upper tier rosters that are just loaded from top to bottom in terms of their construction. If Blue Otter can, even just compete in a series like this, I think that will be considered a win. If they can win a series like this, all of a sudden you're looking at a miracle team that can go on a miracle run because there's clearly some magic voodoo behind their games. But for now, I'm expecting the top seeds to move forward, Supernova and DarkZero. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be posting about every single series here in the NACL as we always do, but we're covering all 4 of the major regions as well. So LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL. A couple of those regions are getting very close, or hell, even have already started playoffs in LTA North's case. So, stick around on the channel for overviews and analysis of those series as well. I am casting, as well as you guys probably know at this point, for LPL English. You can check that out. Links are in the description. I will be on the night of Tuesday, morning of Wednesday, whatever is easiest for you guys to understand, depending on time zone in that regard. Obviously, things can get a little bit shaky because it's China time, but we'll be on this week if you want to see me cast live. I'm one of the final series of the LPL regular season, and we're getting into play-ins, and, I'll be around for play-ins and playoffs on LPL English as well. So check out the YouTube, the Twitch, subscribe, follow, whatever's easiest on your preferred platform down below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all